that we've kind of hammered. Explique. I can spell, I promise.
I can misspell.
So we've talked about this concept, explication versus intensification. Who, in their own words, wants to tell me what that means?
Explication means that you say the principle is first and then everything goes back to that.
Kind of, yeah. Let's explaining in detail, explaining the inner workings of it, down to the minutia, right? So he's explaining the heart of the law, yeah, rather than making the law harder. He's not intensifying it, okay? We talked about that. We talked about audience. He's talking to Jews, which is the crowd. He's talking to disciples, which are there. He's talking to the scribes and Pharisees. Okay? So that's our context. Anything else you feel that's worthy of going up there on the board by way of our quick review? Nope? Okay. All right. So we're picking up in chapter 5, starting in verse 33. Chapter 5, starting in verse 33. Jesus continuing says, "And again, you have heard it said to an older generation, do not break an oath, but fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, do not take oaths, not by heaven, because it is the throne of God, not by earth, because it is his footstool, and not by Jerusalem, because it is the city of the great king. Do not take an oath by your head, because you are not able to make an oath, or not able to make one hair white or black. So let your yes be yes, or your no, no. More than this is from the evil one." Talking about oaths. Okay? Oaths are different than vows. We'll talk about that here in a second. All right.
I'm glad I'm married.
So, in 533, this oaths thing, this was an allusion to the Old Testament. It didn't mean cursing. It didn't mean foul language, okay? What it did mean was using God's name in vain. And I don't mean saying, oh my God, okay? Because God is not his name. God is a title that we give to him, right? But it was swearing by Yahweh's name and then not doing what you swore to do. That's what taking his name in vain is. Okay? God's name being brought into a conversation to assure the truth of one's statement is taking God's name in vain. Vows or oaths in the Old Testament could refer to worship, legal proceedings, or affirmations of doing something. Jesus was involved in an oath in Matthew 26. Paul made oaths in 2 Corinthians 1, Galatians 1, Philippians 1, 1 Thessalonians 2. Okay? So oaths and vows are not something that the believer can't do, but there are certain limitations that are being placed on it. Another oath is found in Hebrews 6:16. So the focus is not on oath taking, but rather on failing to perform the vow. Okay? That makes sense? So it's okay to make oaths, it's okay to make vows, just follow through. That's what Jesus is getting at. So this gets really funny. Verses 34 through 36 show how elaborately the rabbis had developed binding and unbinding oaths. So they would make certain oaths to which they were held accountable, and there were certain oaths that were okay to break. Okay, and they trotted a very fine line between the two. So, for example, it was a very common way to appear to be telling the truth by associating one statement with deity. Okay? But all the time knowing that one's oath expressed in certain ways was not legally binding. So you could play a game of words where you would swear by something, God's throne. So you're not swearing by the name of God, you're just swearing by his throne. Or you're not swearing by the name of God, but you're swearing by where he lives. And you could, finagle your way around it so that way it sounds like you're being pious. It sounds like you're going to keep your word, and then you're not. It's not a legally binding thing. So you can lie without lying. Okay. Yeah, double speak. Hang on, I didn't put this in my notes, but I'm curious because there were different conventions. I just want to show you how ridiculous it got. Here you go. I'll just read this from the commentary in my Logos app. In Jesus' days, rabbis concocted a system whereby they defeated the purpose of oaths. They taught that oaths might or might not be binding depending on how one swore. If one swore by Jerusalem, it was not binding. If one swore toward Jerusalem, it was. If one swore by the temple, it is not binding. But if one swore by the temple's gold, it was binding. Okay? If one swore by the altar of sacrifice, it was not binding. But if one swore by the gifts on the altar, it was. So you could kind of make yourself pious sounding and have it be an unbinding oath. Okay? This illustrates the way in which certain teachers manipulated God's word in Jesus' day. When they read a challenging law, they reduced it to something manageable. When they heard love your neighbor as yourself, they redefined neighbors so that not everyone was counted. They refrained from adultery but claimed a right to divorce freely, then take another woman. When they did something with oaths, Jesus cut off oaths entirely. Do not take oaths at all. The rabbinic teaching perverted the purpose of oath. Instead of calling on God to assure honesty, oaths were phrased so as to avoid God's punishment when speaking dishonestly. Since oaths no longer guaranteed anything, Jesus removed the artificial distinction between vows invoked in God's name, which were binding, and those that did not and were not binding. So, whatever anyone says, Jesus says it refers to God, or whenever anybody swears, rather, Jesus says it refers to God. If someone swears by heaven, it invokes God, for heaven is his throne. If someone swears by the earth, he invokes God, for it is his footstool. If someone swears by Jerusalem, he invokes God, because it's the city of the king. And if he swears by the hair on his head, he invokes God, for he rules over our heads. All oaths call God to witness, for he created and sustains all things, even our hair. That's what Jesus is getting at, or lack thereof, right? So, you see how ridiculous it kind of got? But yeah, so binding versus unbinding oaths, he was cutting out their doublespeak. He's like, there's no need for this because anytime you swear, you're swearing by God. So stop taking these oaths. Binding, unbinding. Stop with the distinction. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. It's a lot simpler. Any questions? Do you think we have a problem with this today still?
Oh, we have all sorts of word games.
Yeah, all sorts of word games. They call it legalese. In contracts, you have to read them carefully. That's why you need a lawyer. Okay? Because something you do or say could nullify the whole contract, and then you're, Anyway. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. All right. Let's get back to the text here. like I said, that whole oath thing is just fascinating to me because just one change in the word toward Jerusalem instead of by Jerusalem, right? Makes it not binding or not binding. Anyway. All right, so let's talk about, how many of you have heard of this term? Who knows what Lex means? Rex is king. What is Lex with an L?
Like a lexicon?
Nope. You're thinking Greek.
Yeah, not bad.
This is Latin.
Law.
Okay?
I could read.
Law of retaliation. Okay? Lex talionis. And we're going to be talking about that here with eye for an eye, which is essentially what lex talionis becomes. It's this eye for an eye mentality. It's kind of, who remembers, is it The Forgotten? Where Sean Connery says something to the effect of, if they send one of yours to the hospital, send one of theirs to the morgue. You know, that's lex talionis, right? I love Sean Connery. Anyway, so eye for an eye, right? Law of retaliation. And this was still popular in Jesus' day. This was something that the rabbis would invoke. And he's about to get into this. So let's read it. Starting in verse 38. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, lex talionis. But I say to you, do not resist the evildoer. But whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other as well. And if someone wants to sue you to take your tunic, let him have your coat also. And if anyone forces you to go with him 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not reject the one who wants to borrow from you. Okay? Let's start with the easy one first. So, Jesus is preaching not to take eye for an eye, not to do lex talionis, but rather to show what? Love. Told you it would connect. All right. Mercy, yes. The mile. So have you ever heard the phrase going the extra mile?
Yeah.
This is where this comes from. Does anybody know what practice Jesus is referencing?
The Romans.
Romans. Okay, so a Roman soldier could pick anyone out at random and say, carry my gear for 1 mile. Forcible conscription. Okay? So what Jesus is saying is, if somebody comes up to you, Roman soldier, a Gentile dog, right? If this Gentile dog comes up to you and says, carry my gear for 1 mile, don't just carry it for 1 mile, carry it an additional mile. Okay? That's the easy one. Everybody track with that one. Go the extra mile. That's what this is coming from. So it's not about putting in extra effort. We often use it that way. That's not what it's calling for. It's calling for you to go to show love, right? To show more love. But I say to you, whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. This one might sound like what Jesus is saying is passive nonviolence, right? So he's preaching pacifism. He's not preaching pacifism. Okay? Because what does he tell Peter to do later? Anybody remember? Go buy a sword. It's not pacifism that he's preaching here. Brian, if I could use you as an example. I just need you to come up here and stand. I want to show you how this works. Okay? Your left hand was your unclean hand. Okay? So it was what you did all your business with. So you rarely use this one. So to smack somebody on the right cheek, if I'm not using this hand, how do I have to swing it, Brian, to hit him on his right cheek?
Backhand.
I have to backhand him. And that's an insult in that culture. You are not even worth my time to smack properly. I'm just going to backhand you. Okay? That's what Jesus is getting at here. I'm not going to hit Brian.
You have to go the extra mile.
So it's this backhanded idea. So basically, what you're saying in that culture is you're not worth the dignity of me slapping you correctly. So what Jesus is saying here is demand equity, demand or is not pacifism. It's I'm a human too. Treat me like one, right? So you're turning him the other cheek. Strike me properly, in other words, right? So the idea there is to prick the conscience of the person who's just struck you, because you're showing them, hey, don't treat me like that. I am a human being too. I am your equal, right? So,
Give an example in real life. Somebody just walks over you, calling you all sorts of names or whatever. I can't think of one off the top of my head to tell you the truth. How would you deal in day life? Somebody just is a verbal abuser.
well, again, you're asking for them to treat you respectfully. That's not that they're going to, but you say, hey, you treat me with respect because I'm made in the image of God, just like you are. That's the idea here. So you show them by their actions that they have done you wrong.
So I will not allow you to talk to me this way.
Yeah, don't talk to me this way. So you could even an example of this would be like, okay, I'll talk to you, but call me back when you can talk to me respectfully, right?
Or,
Again, you're doing it in a way that shows love and respect to the person to whom you're speaking, but
or
you're not going to basically. I'm not going to allow you to treat me like this. Yeah, you're setting limits, boundaries.
And if it's like a young mother of children whose children are getting abused, she should call the police.
Sure. I mean, if there's abuse there, but yeah, this is more along the lines of interpersonal relationships. So you're the one
who's just been backhanded, so to speak. It's how you are to deal with the person.
Right.
So that's what Jesus is giving.
So let's see here. Anything in my notes that is gonna an eye for an eye. This is an allusion to Exodus 21, 24. So that Exodus 21, 24. It's stated again in Leviticus 24, 20. And it's stated again in Deuteronomy 19, 21. Anybody know what Deuteronomy means in Greek?
Second time.
Deuteros 2, Namas is law, Deuteronomy, second giving of the law. There you go. All right. So he gives a series of 5 examples for Jesus' new ethics concerning our attitude toward others, both insiders and outsiders. These are historically conditioned examples. They advocate for an attitude, not a hard and fast rule for every society or age, but it is the spirit of the believing, or it is in the spirit of the believing offended party, which should issue positive actions of love. They should not be interpreted as covering inappropriate or repeated requests from trickery or lazy people. Okay?
No.
Huh?
Explain.
So it's not like somebody is ongoingly treating you poorly. There's a different process for that. This is just interactions with people, kind of like a one-time or as a spirit that we should have about us. So, for example, do not resist the evildoer, but whoever strikes you on the right cheek. We already talked about that. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, so in that day they had an outer garment and an inner garment. Okay, so the outer garment was usually very colorful. It was usually very light, and so they usually cost quite a bit. So if somebody wants to sue you for your outer garment, give to them your tunic also. Your tunic, the inner garment, was what you used for warmth. It was what you used to, usually you used it as sleepwear, because it was your It was like long johns almost. It kept you warm, kept you insulated. Okay, and actually Jerusalem does get cold. So Israel does get cold. It has kind of our same climate, especially in the mountains. It snows. So in the law, you could sue somebody for their outer garment, but you were prevented from taking the garment which was essential for survival, which is that inner garment. Okay. So what Jesus is saying here is the spirit that you should have is if somebody wants to take your outer garment, let him have your inner garment also. Okay? That's the spirit that we should have. All right? Just like the spirit that we should have is demanding that somebody treat us with respect and equity when they're not. Okay? Or rather, we're requesting that they treat us with equity. If anyone wants, we already talked about that. Give to the one who asks of you. Don't be stingy. Okay? That's another spirit that we should have about us. Give to the one who asks of you. And do not reject the one that wants to borrow from you, whether that's time or money. Again, this is within reason. It's discretion, right? But don't reject the one who wants to borrow from you. Because, again, that was another thing in that day and age where they wouldn't necessarily do that. Okay? An evil person. Let's look at that term there. This could, in context, refer to the first century legal system in the sense that it was better to endure additional insults than take a covenant brother, i.e. another Jew, to an unbelieving judge. If evil relates to Matthew 5:37, it could refer to the evil one. But there's also a third option, which is the one who injures you. Okay? So there could be a number of different ways we could take the evil one. I would tend to think it's the one who's the injuring party. But you could also be taking, there's an argument to be made about taking your covenant brother, your Jewish brother, to a Gentile judge. Jews in that day and age, when you wanted to have legal adjudication done, you would go to the elders, you would go to the Sanhedrin, you would go to your people. You would not take the argument to a Gentile court unless you wanted to be shady about it, right? And that's what Jesus is saying. So I'm thinking the evil one could be the one who takes it before the Gentile judge or the one who is the injuring party. Both are arguable there. And that's not a hill I'm going to die on. Yeah, so I got a little bit ahead of my notes here, but yeah. Shirt versus coat. The first item of clothing refers to an undergarment. The second refers to the outer garment. This is a hyperbolic statement. Jesus is not advocating for nudity. Okay? This is an allusion to Exodus 22, 26 through 27. Say that again. Exodus 22, 26 through 27. Deuteronomy 24, 10 through 13. Deuteronomy 24, 10 through 13. And the central truth of this entire section is that Christians should go beyond what others expect of them. The purpose is to encourage unbelievers to be attracted to God through your actions. Okay? So this is that old adage, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words. Okay? And I think that's where I'm going to stop for today because my voice is faltering. So we'll pick up again next week with Love Your Enemies, and we'll go from there. Quite welcome. Excuse me.